The poor man's Puyo Puyo. Heck, dare I say it, the poor man's Tetris? Well, for me, Columns will always stand head and shoulders above the competition. Why? Because I had a Mega Drive. Well, to be more specific, I had a Mega Drive in Mega Games 1. Great game. But who cares? As a young lad, never was I more addicted than with this game. Sure, other games have come and gone, completely devouring my time, way more than Columns did, but heck, this was probably my first gaming addiction that I can think of. And that's why I'm here today, to go back to discover what else there was, and thankfully, there is in fact far more Columns goodness than you may expect. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Ah, Columns. What a hang on a minute. This is Tetris. Only joking. I'm not blinded by the Sega lights. Well, not completely anyway. Tetris is fantastic. A game changer. No pun intended. Created by Alexei Pudjanov in Moscow and ended up being the first ever entertainment software to be exported from USSR to the US, where it was published by Spectrum Holobyte for the Commodore 64 and the IBM PC. That was before it went on to literally every video game console imaginable. Now I'm sure you've heard all of the crazy hullabaloo regarding Nintendo and the fight for the right to the Tetris name, resulting in that original owner practically getting nothing for his brilliant idea. Yeah, well, what you may not know is that this guy, Steve Hanawa, was such a big fan of the puzzle game that he introduced it to Sega of Japan. Mr. Hanawa was at the time actually working on Monopoly for the Master System of all games, and they went ahead and not only made an immensely popular in Japan arcade game, but also a Mega Drive game too. That's right, Tetris on the Mega Drive. However, due to the craziness nature of who owned what, Sega quickly cancelled the production of the Mega Drive game, and it's believed now that there's only about 7 or 8 official carts ever made, making it one of the, if not the most rarest and expensive game for the system ever. Anyway, Mr. Hanawa went off and basically in search for his next Tetris, as he puts it, was shown Columns by a friend with a PC, and after showing off the game to Sega of Japan, they obviously liked the game so much that they decided to buy all of the rights to it from the developer and turn Columns into a Sega only brand. And, well, that's exactly what they did. But who made Columns? Well, that would be Jay Gearston. At the time, in 1989, Jay was actually working at Hewlett-Packard and using a HP-UX operating system created the first iteration of Columns. However, due to the obscurity of the system, it was eventually ported to DOS, Macintosh and the Atari ST. And that's really it. Because after the rights were obtained by Sega, they went ahead and made Columns Sega only. Actually, that's not 100% true, but more on that in a minute. The very first game was released. Not on the Mega Drive, but instead the arcade, and was called, Columns. So I suppose it's time to actually talk about the game. You play on this side in Player 1 mode, and this side if you're Player 2. Now, unlike Tetris, where you have several recognisable shapes falling one after another to hopefully get a horizontal line which deletes said line, in Columns you have 3 coloured looking gems that you switch between to hopefully get 3 or more in a row to delete them. And if you're clever, or more than likely lucky enough to start a chain reaction, well, that's all good too. That's really it. Gameplay at its most basic form. And because of its basic nature, it's incredibly addictive and an instant fun classic for all. On top of this, the music, the art style and the excitement of getting another magic jewel helps create a game that is probably not that unique to look at nowadays with the bajillion App Store puzzle games out there, but for the time and for me and my family, it was a great time waster. The arcade game was good fun and was a huge success for Sega in Japan arcades when it was released on New Year's Day in 1990. And as the company already had the Mega Drive released, a console that was constantly promoted as having like-for-like arcade graphics, Sega released this game for that. Pretty much perfectly, in all honesty. Now, with the huge success of the Game Boy that without a doubt owned a good percentage of its popularity to the incredible pack-in game at launch, Tetris, the perfect game to show off the system, a killer app if you will. Well, with the Game Boy looking like this, and the Game Gear looking like this, technically columns being all about colours rather than shapes would work perfectly for the system. And, well, it did. The Game Gear version plays brilliantly. Obviously the Game Boy was immensely more popular, and I'll be the first to admit it, that I'm in the minority for overall preferring columns over Tetris. And hey, if you ask me, releasing columns for the Mega Drive several months before this version on the Game Gear changed this from becoming a killer app to simply just being a good game for the system. Either way, the Game Gear version was a really well ported version of an already solid game. Following on from this, the game was re-released several times on the Mega Drive to clear old stock, as well as the game being ported several times by System Soft to Japanese home computers, such as the PC 8801, the PC 9801 and the Sharp X68000, whilst Telnet Japan worked on the MSX and FM Town ports, and Lasersoft worked on the PC Engine port. But the strangest port was done by Media Factory, who released, believe it or not, a Super Famicom version through the Japan exclusive Nintendo Power rewritable cartridge service, and it was the only Sega property to see an official release on this system. Other than the game being available on literally every Sega compilation going, Sega released a fair few sequels for the classic game. First up, let's look at Columns 2, Voyage Through Time. Other than a few sprite swaps, this game pretty much is the same game. Now if you ask me, number 3 is probably the best version of the lot, and even features a storyline. Sure, it's as basic and plain as one would expect from a game that is basically Connect free, but because of the story, it gave the game more of a competitive single player mode, as it introduces the stack columns mechanic. Eliminate more than 3 or get a chain and you'll reduce the playing field of the competition, as you went against several different, to be fair pretty boring looking, enemies to eventually make your way to the end of the pyramid and get the treasure to complete the game. Next up, Sega returned to the arcades with stack columns. Nothing much to say here, other than that it looks quite nice, and it has some quite interesting characters. Like I said, there's really not much to say about this one whatsoever. So moving on, in 1995, Super Columns for the Game Gear was released, and featured the very best of all the games, including that crappy storyline. However, the biggest change in the storyline is the ability to turn your columns sideways. Columns 97 appeared in, funnily enough, 1997, and is everything we have expected from the series so far, but with 3D graphics. A slight change for the series came out the very same year with Hanagumi Taisen Columns, and its sequel Hanagumi Taisen Columns 2, which if you don't know is an extremely popular franchise in Japan, co-developed by Sega and the game developer Red, who still release games in the franchise to this very day. The game takes the competitive nature of the later column games and covers it with that Hanega Tusen skin, and yep, it's probably one of the better versions of the game. Probably the least well known of the franchise is Columns GB Suzuka Osamu characters, made by yet again Media Factory. Strangely enough, this version was a Game Boy Color Japan exclusive. In 2001 the series found its way onto the Game Boy Advance with Columns Crown. And although it has no extra features, it is nice to take the series on the road again. Plus it does feature a nice multiplayer option with the Game Boy Advance link cable. Columns Duel was an Android game released only on Japanese mobile phones as part of the Puyo Sega service, which is basically a subscription service where you pay 300 yen a month and get access to loads of games, some of which are exclusive just like this one. However, it is just basic columns, which finally brings us to the very final game in this list, with Columns Deluxe, another Android game, which is actually half columns and half Puyo Puyo. Now, Puyo Puyo is a game that has actually far surpassed columns in popularity and has therefore overshadowed the series completely. It's safe to say that we most definitely have not seen the end of this franchise. Like I said, Sega still put these games out on every single classic collection they pump out, and as of the making of this video, it's only been about 5 years since the last one. I love columns. I think that's pretty damn obvious. I just created a whole complete history video based on a pretty simple puzzle game. But hey, for whatever reason, columns for the Mega Drive has played a decent role in my video game past, and for that I personally felt like it was fully worth giving the franchise its time in the spotlight. But no matter what version of columns you get, you can be damn sure of a good time. Don't let this extremely cheap retro game put you off. Columns is great fun, classic fun, and in my opinion is well worth your time on the system of your choice, which luckily enough is basically all of them. Hey guys, thanks for checking out my video. If you want to check out some more of my videos, click the links that you see at the top of the screen. If you haven't already, please rate, favourite, comment and subscribe. And if you want to support the show that little bit extra, come and check me out over on Patreon. This is DJ Slope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.